we make our teammates better. And by acting out of collective interests and making a contribution, and it's not a socialist idea, it's a human idea around community and family and connection and contribution and making a difference in the lives of others. And it's extraordinary when you make a difference in the lives of others, when you become a contributor. Wow, life changes for you.
Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrisey, where we share insights from great thinkers. Today I'm excited to be joined by James Kerr, international leadership speaker and coach across sport, business, and military, and author of the best-selling book, Legacy, What the New Zealand All Blacks Can Teach Us All About the Business of Life. James, thanks for coming on the show.
Adam, it's a pleasure. Great to be here.
I'm excited to have a conversation about your work in leadership and how you apply these concepts to sport, business, and military, including the case study from the New Zealand All Blacks. To start on the All Blacks, to kind of paint the picture, we'll take the themes across the different areas. What initially sparked your interest around the All Blacks and the concepts of leadership that you observed within them?
I live in the UK now, but I'm originally a boy from Aotearoa, from New Zealand, the land of the long white cloud, and the All Blacks, the identity, almost the core identity of a country. They're our legends, our heroes, our myths, I think. And not only that, they are almost inarguably, over a long period of time, the most successful sporting unit in human history. It was an opportunity to kind of touch the hem of history, maybe, go inside and understand how that culture works, what creates the conditions for sustained high performance. How do you become the best team in history? More than that, how do you stay the best team in history? And what has leadership, culture, and mindset got to do with it? So they were my driving interests in going inside and exploring that environment and then writing about it.
When you say most successful sports teams, like for listeners that maybe haven't even watched a full rugby match, or might know about the All Blacks and the Haka and that they're really a great team, but like you talk a little bit about what they've been able to do over the decades, and like maybe compared to a Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls or a John Wooden UCLA, or maybe a Cignetti Indiana Hoosiers 2025.
So, John Wooden took the Bruins to 10 in 12 years or something, 10 wins in 12 years at a college level. Fantastic achievement. The All Blacks have run just a notch under 80% for 125 years. There are some of the world's strongest rugby countries who have never beaten the All Blacks. They've been ranked world number one for just around about twice as long as the rest of the world combined. They're an exceptional outlier in terms of performance. They've never really returned to the mean, if you like. They've always been there or thereabouts, and managed to kind of rebuild and take it to the next level. So it's the sheer sustained nature of their success that's so extraordinary. Often teams are seen as, they're dynasties. The Michael Jordan or the Phil Jackson, 6 championship rings over a period of time. Where were they before and where are they now? They're there or thereabouts, but it's not that consistent level of dominance that they've shown. I think it's that sustained nature. And of course, they're not the same people in the team all the time. John Wooden was the John Wooden era. Michael Jordan was the Michael Jordan era. But there have been many such eras within the history of the All Blacks. And so it's not the people in the team. It is the men in the jersey, but there's something about the jersey itself and what it means and the standards and expectations around that have led to a culture, I think, of constant reinvention, of constantly getting better all the time. So there's something unique, I think, about that, the winning after winning and the sheer sustained nature of the success and the role of culture, of ethos in order to achieve that.
Do you think like a national team just inherently has a higher probability of being able to do something like this? I mean, there's a guy in my office that's from Ireland, and we'll talk about the golden years of Irish football, to my limited knowledge of like the Roy Keane years and such. So, but like Chicago Bulls, right? Like very few of those team members were from Chicago. Like they're working, like, you talk about the concepts of identity and belief and belonging.
That's a fair take. I think it's probably easier in terms of when you represent a national identity, that identity exists already. When it's a country like New Zealand, which is small and on the other side of the world, and the All Blacks become a symbol of national pride and national identity, and you grow up kind of soaking it in, from your mother's lap, if you like, then sure. But that being said, I think a lot of the principles at play, you can certainly accelerate in all great groups. And most groups come from different places, always. But how do you create a sense of connection, of belonging, of clarity around who we are and how we play? I mean, I think those are questions that apply to all leadership groups, all leaders, the need to create that sense of common cause and the cohesion that comes from that. And really, cohesion, a number of people or a group of people acting towards that same tip of the spear, if you like, is really a competitive advantage. And so your ability to, I think there's an Elon Musk quote, to align the vectors, to get everyone pointed in that same direction is very much a cultural question. And sure, a team like the All Blacks has some natural advantages around that, or the Springboks, or the Brazilian football team, or whoever. But I'd also argue that the Bulls have an extraordinary pedigree that you feel proud to be part of. The Lakers, Celtic.
UCLA basketball is still UCLA
basketball is a thing.
Yeah.
It's a center of gravity for talent. How do you kind of sort signal from noise, if you like, and understand what the drivers are of that collective identity and common cause? And how do you create the conditions in which talent gets better every day? They're perennial questions, I think, for any leader.
I'm excited to kind of shift to some business and some other sports teams and organizations you work with. Before we do, I mean, is there one story that you feel from Legacy really captures the ethos of the All Blacks, like one locker room moment or one game?
Yeah. I think there are many, and I think that's the truth around cultures. In some ways, a culture is an ethos, is a story, is a collective story about what it means to play. The most famous story, I think, from the book is the fact that the All Blacks, after a test, and you have to remember the most famous rugby players in the world, maybe they've just gone out and competed in front of tens of thousands of people, millions around the world. They've battled for the win. There are still helicopters overhead waiting for them to leave the locker rooms, the sheds, they call it in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But the All Blacks, before they leave, sweep the sheds and tidy up after themselves. Now, there are not a lot of teams that do that. More teams now since the book came out, but not a lot of teams that do that. And I think it's an embodiment of a core cultural principle around humility, about being grounded, about keeping it real, about self-reliance. The All Blacks, no one needs to take care of the All Blacks because the All Blacks can take care of themselves. I think that story in itself, and actually it's very deliberate storytelling. That was a decision, and a very emotionally intelligent decision, to put that in place as a kind of a ritual of connection, of service, of being grounded, of self-reliance, of responsibility and accountability. All of those things, which are incredibly important elements of a great group, is kind of captured in a ritual. I refer to it as a ritual that was implemented deliberately in order to keep the boys' feet on the ground, And so I think there are many layers to that story. It was a use of storytelling to keep that team grounded and united and humble and in service of something bigger than themselves. But also it's emblematic of that culture, which is in service of something bigger than themselves. There's a phrase in the team, to leave the jersey in a better place. That idea of legacy, it's this long continuum. What am I going to do with my time in the team? What's my contribution going to be? What's my chapter going to be within something bigger than myself? Now, that mindset, that servant mindset, what Jim Collins would call enterprise leadership, kind of a ferocious attitude in service of something bigger, I think is really at the heart of all great groups, actually. Any group that becomes individualistic, that becomes serve myself, you want to play for what's on front of your jersey, not what's on the back, is the old cliche. How do you create an environment in which you're playing for what the badge and what's on front? And they're the successful groups and the successful leaders and the successful individuals. So I think that idea of, well, listen, no one's bigger than the team. No one's too big to do the small things that need to get done. We take care of things. We have our hand up. We see a messy locker room. We take care of it. That's the mindset of sort of contribution that you want in a team, because that leads to great groups.
You speak to one more on the All Black. Can you speak to the significance of the haka?
I mean, the haka is an amazing thing. And for those of you who know nothing about the haka, it comes from Maori culture, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And it's kind of thought about as a war dance, but it's actually not really a war dance. It's a challenge. It's a fronting up. It's saying, I am here and you are there. Let's bring it on, right? But it also has a lot of embedded meaning. And we talk about storytelling, a lot of embedded meaning. And, the sound of the haka is the sound of the earthquake. And that earthquake shakes the earth and it splits it open and it releases our ancestors to come up from the earth to stand beside us in our struggle, in our competition, in our battle. It reminds us that we're part of that long unbroken chain, stretching from the beginning of time to the end of eternity. And we're all linked arm in arm. And over us, the sun shines, but just for a moment, just this brief moment that is our life. And it reminds us that, life is brief. And we have this brief moment to make our mark, to make our contribution, to represent all those who come before and those who will come after, to unlock our potential, talents and potential, and put them to good use, to be useful, to be a good ancestor, to add to the legacy, or as I said, the All Blacks say, to leave the jersey in a better place. Now, that's the embodiment of a servant mindset, I think. That idea that no one is bigger than the team, no one is bigger than this life that we lead, that life is brief, that we have an obligation, a responsibility and a gratitude to those who come before us, but also a kind of that our legacy maybe is written in the lives. There's a wonderful proverb from Greece that, that old men grow great, societies grow great when old men plant trees they'll never sit in the shade of. Mm-hmm. What are we really doing here? We're not just grasping for what we can get. We're looking for what we can contribute. And I think it calls us to greater things. So it's very powerful. And I think the haka also is deeply connective. As I said, cohesion is the lifeblood of a great group. If you can create embodiment rituals around identity and team and vulnerability, it's not easy to do, to learn, you have to be part of something. It's a fantastic kind of embodied metaphor of what it means to be an All Black. And it also scares the crap out of people when they face it. But it also marks the moment. It's very special. And so it's a very powerful way of setting a state, psychologically, of setting a state in which what we do matters. It's got all of that. It's also great theatre. It's a great piece of the brand. It has a very functional, psychologically powerful way of connecting and unifying a group. It almost says, this is us, bring it on. You walk in emboldened by that, you're in a good place to go out and play a bit of footy and see what happens.
Yeah, so many thoughts on that. I mean, there's a girl from a Nobel laureate named W.S. Merwin, lived in Hawaii, and in real life, he planted a very big forest that became a conservatory and whatever, but he's got a poem called Place that starts with, if today was the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree. Nice. Just as you're sharing, I was thinking about Jordan Peterson does a couple things, basically it's hey, if you want, the best way to have a great life, to assume as much responsibility as you can.
And ownership and responsibility and accountability and purpose and leadership and they're all part of the same bundle. One of the things, again, with the All Blacks was to shift the players from a dependent mindset to an independent mindset. In the book, I call this a kind of pass the ball. How do you create an independent mindset? You give them a responsibility. Pass the ball. Take the ball and run with it. Autonomy and accountability and agency, again, are all part of that same sort of Venn diagram. Somebody else put it to me very well. Your kind of level of maturity is the number of keys that you have on your key ring. What are you responsible for? What are you taking care of? Because no one else will. House, children, businesses, society, communities, pets, all of them are a responsibility. And if you're prepared to take them on, then you grow and you're deeply satisfied by it. That's the stuff. When you look back, you go, I'm glad I did that. It wasn't easy, but it's like that type 2 fun. It provides deep satisfaction over time, I think.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of things you're talking about, seem, are somewhat countercultural, especially I'm looking at this through a Western view, but in our individual lives or they say like, hey, like, great athletes do achieve greatness for, 7 to 10 years if they're lucky.
Yeah.
But, like regular human beings with real jobs have to have like sustained performance, over decades. But, this concept of in the West, especially, like there's less shared stories as
Yeah.
religious groups, ethnic groups, social groups, kind of the media and the movies and such, like find your own story, less appreciation for ritual. There's less appreciation for, we don't even value gray hairs as much anymore, it's just becoming, more individualistic. So, and, even within the organizations, like in America, we shifted from the, you work for the same company for 40 years, gold watch pension, stuff like that to, maybe it's not even rewarded. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, we can do it through the lens of organizations. I'm just like what you feel the status quo is.
With groups I'm working with, in terms of that tension between collective and individual. I think you say it's countercultural, and I think to a degree there is a countercultural element to it, right? But I think often success is countercultural.
Sure.
Not doing what everybody is doing is a pretty good way to be outstanding. Literally, you stand out, right? So there are some fundamental sort of truths, I think, that have always been true certainly around successful groups. Now, you might say, listen, once upon a time, we had this loyalty to an organization, but we still have our families, virtual teams. We still have relationships around. And so if you start thinking about, it's all about, I mean, no marriage ever survived when everyone just took what they could. No family ever survived if people just took what they could, right? It's contribution that counts. And I think we all kind of know that. And even though social media says, write your own story, make it all about you, right? I'm not sure that necessarily sets you up for genuine success. You need your own narrative and a healthy ego. But an unhealthy ego is, when we talk about spiritual traditions, every spiritual tradition in the world has really been around the dissolution of the individualistic ego into the idea that you're not here for a long time. This too, however good it is, will pass. What contribution will you make right now? And you think about teams, one of my favorite teams from the US, San Antonio Spurs. It's a collective team. How can I make my teammates better? One of their mantras. Brilliant mantra. You look at, I don't know, baseball, and you look at Toronto, Blue Jays. They didn't win in the final stretch, but they were pure team, that team. And great groups play without sounding soft. They play for love. Fellowship. You talked about Stephen Pressfield. He writes, of course, about the Spartans, or wrote about the Spartans. He's written about high-performing ethos and that idea of love and brotherhood and taking care of your mate. The Spartan shield is there to protect the person beside you. Your sword is for you. There is always a return on relationship. One of my favorite coaches recently in the Premier League here in the UK, Jurgen Klopp, has a great line where he says, I don't collect trophies, I collect relationships. Human connection is extraordinarily powerful. And in fact, I would argue is a competitive advantage, is our species' competitive advantage. We have opposable thumbs and abstract thought and the ability to communicate abstract thought. But it all comes together when we can combine our efforts in order to execute those ideas using our tools, right? Building skyscrapers, passing the ball into space, whatever it is. I think almost that countercultural tendency is almost more deeply cultural, actually, in terms of the way that human beings really, really work. We win in teams. No one really wins alone. And that's a myth, I think, and quite a dangerous myth. And, interestingly, you talked about what I assume was sort of the algorithms. We don't all speak the same story. But look how strong the stories are within the groups that do speak the same story.
Oh, yeah.
Whether that's kind of on the political right or on the political left. They're very, very embedded, strong stories and people's story about the world becomes the truth of the world and the way they act. And so united around common cause, common values, common story, if you like. You read Sapiens, the book. The premise of that book is that it's all a story. It's all a fiction. It's just a convenient fiction that we grab hold of in order to live. And a company is a story. This podcast is a story. There's a way of coming together. And so I think we do cluster around those fundamental, axiomatic elements of what it means to be human. And there are tribal elements in that. And forget that at our peril, I would say.
I think, I had a guest who was a PhD in mythology from the Campbell Institute, and we talked about the idea that we don't actually live in the world, we live in our stories about the world. Peterson would say, in a life that you can choose meaning or meaninglessness, why would you settle? I believe spirituality is true, but I also believe it's the most practical way to live.
Whoa. There's an interesting thought experiment, and you go, is God true? And you go, well, churches are true. Right? Churches get built, right? Now, everyone's got their view of whether God is inside or in every rock or sitting on a fluffy cloud, right? Does that, in some ways, that is irrelevant. It's as you say, it's a very practical way to understand the mystery, and real things come of it, whether it's churches get built or Israel and Palestine and go to war, or the Ayatollah announces something. And these are real in phenomenon in the human dimension. And so, I think I agree with your point. Does it matter? What matters is what happens, what is actual. Is God real? Well, he's real enough to be a human phenomenon, or she is real enough to be a human phenomenon, or it, or they, or whatever is real enough to become a human phenomenon, and that defines the way we see the world. As you say, I think we lead from within. We decide our story. First we shape our story, then our story shapes us. One of the most powerful things, coming back to what you originally said, where we went around identity in the All Blacks. Yeah, sure, the All Blacks have got an advantage. They've got 125 years of national identity and All Blacks identity all cohering into one thing. But any startup knows you can start to create your own story. And you go, right, what do we stand for and what won't we? And it's some of the work I do with teams around identity. What do you stand for and what won't we stand for? What are our values? What's our vision? What's the world we want to have come about? Why does it matter? What are our standards, therefore? What are our behaviors from that standard? Now, that's the core of an ethos. Ethos originally means character, the character of an organization. We create our character through the way we codify the world. And that code is a story of sorts. And there's an old thing from programming, garbage in, garbage out, but quality in, quality out. If you put a quality story in, quality characteristics, quality values, high standards, the standard you set is the standard you get. A compelling narrative of meaning, of why what you do matters and means something, then that will galvanize a group around common cause. And, they become self-fulfilling to a degree. The standards you set are the standards you get. You shape your story, then the story shapes you. The story you tell yourself will become the story that others tell about you. There is a sort of reflexive truth in that we create not from the past, but from this imagined future. And that future is a story. No one ever climbed Mount Everest without imagining themselves on the summit. I doubt whether many people who ever gave an Oscar speech didn't rehearse it when they were 13 years old in the mirror. We project ourselves into an imagined future, and that imagination creates a narrative that we often live into. And it doesn't always go our way, but we're much more likely to go our way. And I think that's the power of identity, of ethos, of story, of culture itself, to shape the conditions in which and the trajectory of and the direction that we go in.
I definitely agree. I think it all comes back to identity. And when you were sharing that, I was thinking just like kind of if you boil it down, like what is the underlying story that seems common? Is it just that this, whatever this is, matters?
And you look at Viktor Frankl. I don't know if you've read who writes, for those who haven't, about his experiences and the experience of the camps, concentration camps in World War II. His meaning was an unfinished manuscript that later became half of the book, Man's Search for Meaning, that was sitting hidden in a locker, I think in Vienna. And he lived to see the day when that was published, right? That's what he lived for. And I think it's a really important question. What do we live for? What do we live for? And if you take Camus and the myth of Sisyphus condemned to push a rock to the top of a mountain, and it will just roll down, and you have to do it again. It's like painting the Sydney Harbour Bridge. It never ends. Unless you love the rock, unless you choose the rock, unless you decide that rock matters, what's the point? That's what gets you through the tough times. That's what gives you the satisfaction. And so therefore, purpose isn't necessarily easy, and maybe it shouldn't be easy, because it lifts us to better things, and it provides the juice, the responsibility, the joy, ultimately. It's not about pleasure. It's not easy pleasure. It's deeper purpose. But from deeper purpose, I think you get deeper satisfaction. I'm on for that. I think that's exactly the way it works.
Yeah, I think, people, in our age of FOMO and, cultural stories, like, if you look at, social media, it's all about, hey, like, you should go on this next trip,
Yeah.
But, making sure, I'm a big believer in introspection. I interviewed Daniel Pink a couple years ago. We talked about this, the balance between contemplation and action, creating versus making. If you don't take time to think, you might get, I think Daniel Pink said, you might get really good at creating things that don't matter.
The story, if we look at stories again, there's the Abraham Lincoln story. If you've got 7 hours to cut down a tree, spending 6 hours sharpen the axe. And that's a metaphor, again, another story, an instructive story about making sure you're putting your ladder against the right wall. Reflection, of course, and introspection is how we learn. And often in this world that seems to value busyness, and actually being busy can be an antidote for anxiety, is not necessarily easy, and particularly in a attention economy where social media is screaming and fear of missing out, and my life's going, moving away out of my control, and actually stopping and being quiet. And there's a lovely line, don't just do something, stand there. Be present to yourself and really know that. And it's the most ancient mantra in human history, know thyself. There's a real relationship, I think, in leadership between the first thing you lead is you lead your life. And the way to lead your life, and we go back to the Stoics, is you got to lead yourself. You need to regulate yourself. And regulation is to rule, is to lead. So self-regulation is the beginning of leadership. And I do a lot of work around mindset and with athletes around that. The calmest person in a crisis is the person everyone turns to instinctively. You have on sport out there on the field, if it's a total mess, people take their self-regulatory cues from the person who is most present in that moment and therefore most calm. We lead from within. It begins within. And there's another phrase, I can't quite remember it, but paraphrasing is inside, thus without. The state that we are in, the narrative, the way we are being becomes the way the world occurs to us. And so our first responsibility as leaders is to self-regulate and lead ourselves. Not always easy at all. And particularly in a world that rewards kind of action and energy and all of that, being able to toggle switch between, as you say, creation and making, I think is a massive life skill.
Gay and Katie Hendricks of The Big Leap were on the show, and we talked about that. Identity, stories, habits, like layer on nervous system. Like, we're habitual people, not always ritualistic, but habitual. We do the same things, but every opportunity is a chance to shift a pattern. Very difficult to do that without your nervous system, because we can get triggered and such. I want to talk a little bit about how you've seen culture change in like the business setting, because it takes place over longer time horizons. Not everyone on the team necessarily loves and they would say, the kid who's at the gym at 11 o'clock. Not everyone loves the sport, or the craft. So you got time horizons, you got turnover, you got different levels of interest. It's a really interesting classroom, I think.
I think first we have to define what we mean by culture, because culture is kind of everything. And what is the purpose of it? Maybe in a business setting or in a leadership setting, I think is a way to look into it. And you go, There's the old line, I think it was Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If you can get your culture right, which is really around alignment, common cause, expectations, standards that are enacted. How do you create that? I think there are a number of, in a book I'm writing at the moment, there's a number of, they all seem to begin with the word C. I call it the C suite, the culture suite, but not the book, but the section. And, clarity is hugely important. There's a phrase, clarity is intensity. If we're not really deeply clear about and have articulated, who we are and how we win, our clear values, what we stand for, what we stand against, a clarity of mission, and a clear driving purpose, then we're all going to run in different directions, right? So clarity, and there's we talked about storytelling again, but George Bernard Shaw has another great quote, which is, the great illusion about communication is, or the great problem with communication is the illusion it's ever happened. I'm paraphrasing. A lot of the time, the C-suite, they know exactly what the strategy is. They know exactly how they're going to win, but no one else does. Having a CEO who is chief storyteller and chief becomes hugely important, and doesn't always happen, right? So clarity becomes hugely important. Connection becomes hugely important. Do we feel that we're part of this? Do we feel we belong? Do we feel like you said, that it matters? Now, the question then is, how do you create that? How do you create that level of connection? I think the most powerful way of doing it is co-creation. There's a line from Wayne Smith, the great All Black coach. He said, people rise to a challenge if it's their challenge. The military over here in the UK say empowerment is people executing a plan they've played a part in planning, right? Do people feel that they have a voice, that their point of view is, seen, heard, and respected? Most organizations don't focus on that. They, another line, I'm full of lines today, but no one ever followed a PowerPoint into battle.
Sure.
Yeah, sure, I know what you want me to do, but I don't feel it. And so a question is, how do you feel? And then you go, how do you do that on scale? Well, that becomes tricky, but I think the trick around that is Stan McChrystal's, formulation of a team of teams. Right, that large organizations aren't really made up of thousands of people. They might be made up of dozens or hundreds of teams of people. And it's what happens within those teams that really matters. And kind of atomic particle that creates an organization is the team. So have a team culture that extrapolates outwards to become your organizational culture, I think is a smart way of looking at it. And I would add to Stan's kind of team of teams and almost say it's team by teams, like a multiplier. If you get a great team being a great team, and it is great at working inside that team, but it's also part of its DNA is it's great at working with other teams, then each team multiplies the impact of the others. And it's our natural environment to work at our best. If you look at, there's a sociologist over here in the UK called Dunbar. It's sort of Dunbar's number. There are different levels of the way we organize as a society. Yep. There is the warrior band, the idea that, which is a team, a squad, a team. The average size, it's 15 to 30-ish, maybe 50 at the most. It's the size of a platoon. It's the average size of a sales team. It's your most visited friends group on Facebook. It's an extended family. It's the way we're comfortable. It can be led by example and by personality and by connection. There's a reason that groups organize into that kind of zone. That's really, I think, where culture lives. After that, it becomes very abstract, too abstract. So if those who lead a large organization who are listening, I think small. Think, okay, what I'm actually doing is creating an operating code, for a team. And teams operate in very much the same way. Paraphrasing another writer, Tolstoy and Anna Karenina, unhappy families are unhappy for all sorts of reasons. Plenty of ways to be unhappy, plenty of ways to be dysfunctional. Happy families are happy for the same reasons. And I think that's true of teams. There are those core principles that make for highly functional teams, and they tend to be the same. For instance, humility, one of the All Blacks' core values. We talked about sweeping the sheds. The British SAS, the Special Force outfit, they talk about humility and a sense of humor. The Navy SEALs, on your side of the pond, the trident, the badge of belonging, has its head bowed in humility.
Wow.
So go figure. Very different traditions, same conclusion. And I think that's the hardwiring underneath cultures. If you want to change an organization, I think you do it like in teaching. I'm not sure we capture that on film, but they say, change teaching classroom by classroom. I think you change an organizational culture team by team. I think what you need to do is you need to create the DNA of what a great team looks like and how it works with another team. And if you can achieve that, you get to a really strong point where it's replicable and it's powerful and it's containable, because as soon as you start to speak to everybody, you're speaking to no one.
Yeah.
But you can speak to a room of 15 to 30 people and get them connected and cohesive around common cause. So I think the atomic structure, as I said, the atomic structure of a large organization is on it as a team. And you want to get your team really good at working with itself and really good at working with other teams who are really good at working within itself. And then, boom, things go fantastically well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it operates at such a small level. The venture capitalist Ben Horowitz has a book about culture called What You Do Is Who You Are. That concept, and then the concept of shared language and reinforced, repeated priorities.
Yeah, a future to look forward to, common cause. What are we doing together? What matters? What means something? What's that beacon on the hill? I think what's very powerful about that way of looking at it is we live into the possibility of who we could become. One of the key questions around defining culture and identity is, if that's what we want to become, who do we have to be in order to become it? Mm-hmm. And so we can set our standards based on a future. Bill Walsh, one of my favorite coach authors, he writes, world champions are world champions before they're world champions. You don't become a world champion and then you're a world champion. Your world champion behaviors before you become world champion. But so you have a vision of what you want to become, and you, Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. But then you go, right, if that's what I'm called for, what standard do I have to achieve in order to bring that about? Now, that's a conversation back to teams that can only happen on a team level. Because if you put that to 50,000 people in a bank, whatever, doesn't mean anything. Meaning, again, doesn't mean anything. But if you come to your sales team or your executive team or your, whatever, and you go, right, guys, what do we want to achieve here together? We're not all going to be here forever, right? But what are we going to do with our time in this team? And you go, well, what we want to do is we want to be the most, an executive team, we want to launch the IPO or whatever it is, or we want to be the go-to, the number one brand in the thing, whatever turns people on. You go, okay, let's work backwards and go, right, well, what does that call from us? What do we actually have to do? And you think about it on a strategic level, because that's the way strategy works. You go, what's the end game? What are the performance pillars, the strategic drivers to achieve that? And therefore, what are the tactics that we're going to put into place? So end, ways, means, or objective strategy tactics. You can look at it from a cultural point of view. What do we want to do as a team? What are our core our cultural pillars? What are our everyday behaviors? Same structure. And you can think about that individually. What's my legacy going to be? What am I going to leave behind after I'm gone? Who do I have to be consistently in order to achieve that? What do I do next? And it becomes guide rails on an individual, on a collective basis to write your future history.
I spent a couple of years leading sales and marketing at a tech startup that sold a product and service to home service contractors, tradies, plumbers, HVAC guys. And what I thought was so interesting about it was probably the closest thing to the New Zealand All Blacks cultures you could find, because what I thought was so interesting is a lot of these companies operated outside of city centers. So
Yep.
like we had a $30 million customer in Camden, South Carolina. We had a $50 million contractor in Rochester, Minnesota. Like
Yeah.
these were some of the best employers of the town. They had the shared identity of their city, and they'd go into the big city nearby. What they were able to do from a culture, because they have so much more of a shared story. Like as their
Yeah.
company wins, their town wins.
And they're responsible again for that town.
Yep.
That's meaning and satisfaction and all of that stuff. And so, to that long, big, jangly thing of keys, that idea of loading yourself with responsibility and satisfaction, all of that is part of that same mix. But I think also what's really interesting is, on one level, plumbing or trade isn't superficially a very interesting subject. Right? Doesn't necessarily not hugely meaningful, and on social media it doesn't get a lot of clicks. But that doesn't mean that the commitment is in it. What it is. It's making whatever subject, whatever field, whatever domain, meaningful and urgent and significant. And you can. And they're the same principles. Why does it matter? Who do we represent? What is the impact that we have on the lives of others? One of my favorite quotes is from Pericles. And he just says, our achievements aren't written on stone monuments. They're woven into the lives of others. Contribution that we make to others. And I like to talk about, your funeral. So Adam, when you die, they might mention your podcast. They might mention your podcast. They might. But they're more likely to talk about your character. And they're more likely to talk about, he said something one day that really changed my life.
Mm.
Or he did something. Or I was going through a really hard time and he was there. That's where we get meaning. And that's where we get where it matters. And so, we make our teammates better. And by acting out of collective interests and making a contribution, and it's not a socialist idea, it's a human idea around community and family and connection and contribution and making a difference in the lives of others. And it's extraordinary when you make a difference in the lives of others, when you become a contributor. Wow, life changes for you. For you, for instance, you've got this fantastic podcast. The success of the podcast is that people get something from it.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you get something from it. You might get something from it as a byproduct of the contribution that you make. I sincerely believe that the value you create is directly correlated to the value we give.
Zig Ziglar said it. You can get everything you want out of your life if you help many people as get what they want out of theirs.
Exactly. And it's the reciprocity of human relationship. It's the golden rule. It's at the basis of every religion. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What can I, and that reciprocity of relationship changes the game. And it's as true. And the more ambitious you are, the less it's about you and the more it's about the value you can create for others. And you think about a successful business is an Apple is creating, products of huge value. And the more value that we can create, the more value comes to us. But it works in that order, not the other way around. We don't get to extract value without creating it. So it becomes a really deeply simple way, I think, of being successful and of really being a leader. And I think that's what being a leader is.
James, you've been so gracious with your time this morning. We could have gone for probably many more hours, and which probably means we'll have to do a round two. What's the best way for people to keep up with you and the work you do?
Well, Google is your friend always.
Yeah.
As one of the AI things, it pretty much you can find anything and anybody anywhere at any time. I'm on LinkedIn. The book we've really been talking about is called Legacy. What the All Blacks, the New Zealand All Blacks, can teach us about the business of life. That is on Amazon and all good bookshops, I hope. I've got a book coming out, I think hopefully by the end of the year, called Ethos, funnily enough, which is a sort of a practical way of developing your team and yourself. So yeah, Google is your friend.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have links to all those in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Adam, it's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Tuesdays in Morrisey. That conversation was with James Kerr, international leadership coach, speaker, and author of the book Legacy: What the New Zealand All Blacks Can Teach Us About the Business of Life. What I enjoyed about the episode was learning about the key ingredients for a great team, including identity and story. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with a friend, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks.